It's Whitney Schneidman, and we're ready to move to the next panel. But before we do, just let me extend my greetings to the minister from South Africa and to Ambassador Nhlapo, and just express my appreciation to the Woodrow Wilson Center and the Council on Foreign Relations for convening this session on South Africa. I think it's both very timely and very important. And I'm most pleased that Ambassador Nhlapo in the previous panel introduced the analogy of a boxing match, because I think that sort of opens up a little bit more flexibility for us to, take things in different directions and just continue the very frank and candid discussions. Now, before we get into this, just let me do one housekeeping element, and that is between the time that I was invited to participate and today, there have been some developments, and I have to catch an airplane early in the afternoon, so I'm going to be leaving at 12:30, and we'll pass the gavel to Steve McDonald. But I wanted to tell you that, so as you see musical chairs taking place up here, I apologize for any distraction to you and to the panelists, but trust that it won't break the stride of what I think has been a great discussion so far. So this panel is on the economic dimension of the U.S.-South African relationship. We've tiptoed in this direction throughout the course of the morning, starting with Ambassador Carson, who mentioned that trade relations, not only between the U.S. and South Africa, but South Africa's regional relations, was going to be a priority area for the United States in its burgeoning relationship with South Africa. And I think this panel really gives us an opportunity to drill down on a number of these and other issues. I think it's fair to say that the U.S.-South African economic and commercial relationship is both multifaceted and it is complicated. South Africa is both the largest economy on the continent, and it is the biggest beneficiary of the African Growth and Opportunity Act by far, once you take out the non-oil exports from Africa. South Africa is the economic engine of Africa, but it is also in its first recession after a period of unprecedented and sustained economic growth. South Africa, as we've heard several times this morning, is home to more American companies than any other country on the subcontinent. And for many companies, for many U.S. companies, South Africa is seen as the base from which to move into Africa and to develop a presence in the African market. And at the same time, many American companies are following the lead of South African companies who from all sectors have moved aggressively and effectively into all sectors of the African economy, making a genuine contribution to the continent's economic progress. I think it's important to note, more of a historical note, that through the development of the Sullivan Principles, which obligated American companies to invest an equivalent of 12% of their payroll in socially responsible programs during the apartheid era, that South Africa became the first country in which corporate social responsibility was practiced in any consistent fashion. And today, corporate social responsibility is in evidence in many manifestations throughout the continent and elsewhere throughout the world. When it comes to non-AGOA trade, the picture gets a little bit more complicated. The U.S. spent several fruitless years during the Bush administration trying to negotiate a free trade agreement with the 5 nations of the Southern African Customs Union. It is safe to say that Washington and Pretoria never had a common vision for the structure and benefits of an FTA, and it foundered as a result. And I think it's also fair to ask, can this common vision be forged between the new administrations in both Pretoria and Washington. There's an enduring perception in Washington that South Africa, an active proponent of South-South trade, has adopted a position in the Doha round that supports the maintenance of high tariffs in other emerging economies, that works against the interests of many African countries, and indeed works against the interests of a successful conclusion of the Doha round. I'm sure that will be grist for a couple rounds in the boxing match as well. Ambassador, I was using your analogy earlier. Thank you for providing it to us. In the midst of the global recession, South Africa, under its newly elected government led by President Zuma, has replaced its highly respected Finance Minister Trevor Manuel for the less well-known Gordon Provan, less well-known at least in international business circles. And this has raised some questions of continuity in policy when it comes to South Africa's successful growth-oriented economic policies. Now, to discuss and debate these and other issues, we have an extremely well-qualified panel, and I look forward to hearing from each of them. Our first speaker will be Lerato Matabohi, who is the Minister Counselor for Economic and Commercial Affairs at the South African Embassy here in Washington. Lerato has worked on regional trade issues as the Director of the Southern Africa region at Department of Trade and Industry, and she has taught at the University of Witwatersrand and the South African Institute of International Affairs. Ms. Matabohi has a BA Honors in International Relations from the University of Witwatersrand and an MA in International Political Economy from the University of Warwick. Our second speaker will be Mr. Kevin Boyd, who currently is Director of the Office of Africa at the U.S. Department of Commerce, where he has worked since 1987. Kevin has served as the Director for ASEAN Affairs, where he was responsible for recommending and implementing U.S. trade and commercial policies in the ASEAN member countries. The Department of Commerce has honored Kevin with multiple awards, including the Department of Commerce Silver Medal for his work on the Asian financial crisis. Kevin has earned his master's in economics from the University of Michigan. Our third speaker is Tony Carroll, who has had a distinguished career as a lawyer and business consultant in Africa that spans 3 decades and has been a good friend and colleague of mine for much of that time. Currently, Tony is the Vice President of Manchester Trade Limited, and he's formerly on the Executive Committee of the U.S. South Africa Business Council. He's very active in the Corporate Council on Africa and in many other organizations here in town. Tony earned a BA and a JD degrees from the University of Denver and an MBA from the University of Wisconsin. So let's just jump into it, and let me ask Lerato if you'll come here and lead us off. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Honorable Minister Pando, distinguished excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I would first like to start by thanking the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Studies and the Council on Foreign Relations for organizing this event and for providing us with the opportunity to reflect on the trends and processes that underpin South Africa's economic relationship to the U.S. Such a reflection is increasingly important as both our countries have just ushered in new government administrations. It is thus an opportune time to take stock of how we can strengthen and reinvigorate the relationship between our two countries, not only to our mutual benefit, but to the benefit of the African continent and the world as a whole. South Africa is of the view that our relationship with the United States is a very important and strategic one. The role that the United States has played and continues to play in South Africa's economic development through trade and investment, and the contribution that the American people have made to the process of South Africa's attainment of democracy and transformation, is one that we continue to recognize and appreciate. The United States remains South Africa's largest source of foreign direct investment. By 2008, U.S. investments in South Africa totaled $8.3 billion, representing investments by more than 600 United States entities that currently operate in the South African economy. These investments have benefited the South African economy in terms of job creation, as well as technology and skills transfer, and have also contributed to raising our competitiveness levels. In the area of trade, South Africa remains the United States' largest source of imports in sub-Saharan Africa, if one excludes oil imports from the equation. South Africa is also the #1 destination for U.S. exports to Africa. We are currently the U.S.'s 34th largest trading partner in the world. Bilateral trade has grown consistently in the past years. By 2008, United States imports from South Africa had grown to over $9 billion compared to just over $4 billion in 2003. Exports by the United States to South Africa in 2008 were valued at over $6 billion as compared to a little over $2 billion in 2003. These figures speak to the strength of economic ties between our two countries. We believe that these trade and investment ties will be further strengthened through the implementation of the SACU-US Trade, Investment and Development Cooperation Agreement, which was signed here in Washington, D.C. on the 16th of July, 2008. The agreement is a formal mechanism for the Southern African Customs Union and the United States to conclude a range of interim trade-related agreements with a view to concluding a free trade agreement in the long term. It provides a basis for entering into trade facilitating agreements on technical issues such as sanitary and phytosanitary standards, technical barriers to trade, customs cooperation, trade facilitation, as well as the establishment of mechanisms for trade and investment promotion and facilitation. SACU and the United States officials are working very hard to ensure the expeditious implementation of this agreement through various engagements at technical level. We envisage to hold the first SACU United States Trade Investment and Development Cooperation meeting at the level of ministers before the end of this year. President Jacob Zuma, in his State of the Nation address on the 3rd of June this year, articulated that Africa remains a priority in terms of South Africa's foreign policy objectives. Our relationship with global partners, therefore, should be premised on consolidating the African developmental agenda as espoused in the African Union's program, the New Partnership for Africa's Development. We view our partnership with the United States as one that will aim to address Africa's economic growth challenges through trade and investment, and as a partnership that aims to support Africa's regional integration processes and objectives. The Africa Growth and Opportunities Act, AGOA, is to us a clear example of the United States' commitment to Africa's growth and development through trade. Although not all AGOA beneficiary countries have been able to fully take advantage of this trade preference mechanism due to capacity challenges, we cannot ignore the developmental impact that AGOA has had in sub-Saharan African economies. The duty-free market access opportunities offered through AGOA have served to stimulate production in Africa, as our entities aim to supply the largest economy in the world. A large number of jobs in our economies have been created as a result. AGOA has also facilitated investments to the African continent due to the market access predictability that this mechanism offers. AGOA remains an important instrument for fostering trade and economic development in Africa. We are optimistic that the current United States administration will remain open to the spirit of cooperation and development embedded in the AGOA, whilst we in Africa will continue to implement measures that will render our economies competitive in the global marketplace. We are encouraged by the United States' recognition that challenges such as inadequate physical infrastructure, lack of diversification of production, inadequate human resource, as well as inadequate institutional capacity have rendered African economies uncompetitive and have contributed to African economies not being able to adequately take advantage of AGOA. The United States Africa Trade and Economic Cooperation Forum under AGOA, which brings together United States and African government representatives, as well as private sector and civil society, can serve as a platform to further elaborate on addressing these concerns. United States trade capacity building assistance to Africa that is currently being implemented by agencies such as USAID, USCDA, and the MCC is a vital step in the right direction. Private sector entities from both the United States and South Africa also have a role to play in raising the continent's competitiveness levels and in addressing infrastructure challenges. There is an opportunity for private sector entities to form joint venture partnership and other means of collaboration to invest in energy, telecommunications, road, rail, port infrastructure, as well as invest in value-adding manufacturing capacity on the continent. The United States agency, OPEC, has a role to play in this regard. by facilitating and encouraging U.S. private sector participation and investments in Africa. Furthermore, a majority of Africa's manufacturing firms are unable to operate at full capacity due to outdated machinery and technologies. Opportunities exist, therefore, for United States companies to export the necessary technologies and machinery to the continent for the requisite technological upgrades. Exim Bank can play a facilitatory role in encouraging and supporting these technology exports to Africa. South Africa's partnership with the United States and other global partners is premised on the principle of creating a global environment conducive to sustainable growth and development. We are encouraged by the new U.S. administration's commitment to strengthening multilateralism. We believe that a multilateral rules-based trading system is an important component of a necessary system of global economic governance. We collectively need to preserve and defend a system in which trade rules and trade commitments can be negotiated in a forum, a system in which many countries, developed and developing, are represented and in which each has a voice. We, along with other delegations to the WTO, look forward to renewing our engagements in the Doha round of negotiations, with a new hope that we will yet be able to reclaim the developmental promise of the round. In the current global economic crisis in particular, we believe that it is important that the WTO makes progress in the Doha round of negotiations by actually working to regain a developmental balance and to deliver an outcome which is at least reasonably faithful to the Doha mandate that underpinned the current process. Ministers agreed in Doha in 2001 to launch a round in which, I quote, "the needs and interests of developing countries would be placed at the heart of the work program," end quote. In particular, the Doha Declaration held out the promise that for the first time, agriculture would be subject to serious multilateral disciplines. It has been widely argued and is broadly accepted that agriculture is the locomotive of this round. This has been understood to mean that the pace and ambition set in agriculture will be the touchstone for setting the level of ambition for the round as a whole. There are, of course, good reasons for this. Agriculture is the area where the distortions in the trading system to the disadvantage of developing countries are most stark. Agriculture and agro-industries are also the areas where many developing countries enjoy existing natural comparative advantage, as well as have the best possibility for developing this into competitive value-added advantage. We hold the view that the modalities approach at the WTO has helped to build some benchmarks to determine levels of fairness, proportionality, and commitments, and balance within and between issues. It has fostered a multilateral approach that has created transparency and legitimacy. We understand that the impact of the current economic crisis on the United States enterprises, workers, and families is a matter of high priority for the new administration, just as it is for South Africa and many developing countries, as thousands of workers lose their jobs and industries plead for governments to come to their aid. The current United States internal review of trade policies is a challenging task made doubly hard by the current economic crisis. We believe and are indeed optimistic that the new United States administration will introduce into its trade policies a commitment to multilateralism, fairness, and development. This economic crisis has reaffirmed the great interdependence of our economies. We are all floating on the same boat. We all have a great stake in the restoration of the health of the United States banking system and other major economies, and the recovery of these economies from this recession, including our own. While we have had no part in creating this crisis, our industries and workers are suffering the effects as trade finance, export markets, investments, remittances, and aid have become less available to the poorest developing countries. So we all have a stake in the earliest possible recovery of the major economies. We recognize that some of the necessary measures that are taken to address this crisis may have negative trade distorting effects and harm the production and exports of other countries. There is a great responsibility, therefore, on the part of countries that take these measures to minimize their trade distorting effects and ensure that there is no lasting and structural damage to many vulnerable industries, especially in developing countries. As we go forward towards a regular WTO ministerial conference at the end of the year, we look to the new United States administration to play a leading role in rebuilding the WTO into a global public good for all. South Africa looks forward to re-engaging with the new administration on a new approach, one that balances narrow market access interests and the need to restore balance in addressing the interests of developing countries in the WTO, as the Doha mandate has promised. An approach that focuses on the plight of the poorest countries that require immediate redress and relief. It is this approach and the leadership that will create the new atmosphere that we all require to foster proportionate contribution by all, big and small, developing and developing countries. Thank you.
Kevin, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Madam Minister, Mr. Ambassador, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. One of the marvelous things with serving on a panel with speakers like the two speakers who preceded me is that they do a very good job of covering quite a lot of the very same topics I was planning on covering. It leaves me free to make a few comments about those topics. And then, since the previous panel seemed to have so much fun in terms of the Q's and A's, we'll have plenty of time for Q's and A's. I would, however, note in talking about some of the trade flows and some of the trade statistics, however, that we do need to compare notes. I show South Africa to be our 37th largest trading partner instead of our 34th, and so then we'll need to sit down at some point and compare notes on that, Lorado. Yeah. Having said that, even coming in at 37th, it's in front of several significant trading partners in South America. If you think about that, and you think about the transit times and the problems in logistics and everything else, you're really talking about a quite remarkable trade flows. In addition to that, to my mind, the key thing in terms of U.S.-South African trade is its diversity. Instead of, as in many countries on the continent, you're talking about a couple of goods, you've got a very large flow of significant goods and services. And 2008 was our strongest trading year in history. Now, there's been a few things going on in terms of financial markets and economy since then. You've probably seen it in the news. So trade flows have gone down significantly in 2009 so far. I'm very confident, though, since you've got economic growth forecast to rebound in South Africa to 3% or perhaps 3.2% in 2010. It concluded a very successful 3-day program inside of Cape Town. And we had significant support, as a matter of fact, on that from the South African government to take a look at cross-border flows of intellectual property. And they came out of that 3-day conference with a series of recommendations. And the South African, excuse me, and the South African government, as a matter of fact, has agreed to serve as the secretariat to follow up on implementation. I think there's quite a lot of extremely good work there, and I think it holds out great promise. In terms of the WTO, I'm going to choose not to go too far into a boxing ring on that particular topic. As you probably know, the administration is still going through the process of reviewing some of our trade policies and in taking a look at our trade policy on Africa. I would note, however, our two countries do agree the process should not be a process driven by a deadline. It should be driven by trying to achieve some ambitious outcomes. I would close by simply picking up on a comment that was made by Ambassador Lyman when he said that we have never had a trade policy for the continent. It's true, of course, when you look at AGOA, it has served as a cornerstone. I am not prescient enough to be able to tell you as to how our current process is going to come out. I would, however, say trying to craft one policy for the continent could perhaps be somewhat problematic, since you would not want to have the same policy or same group of policies for South Africa as you would have, for instance, for some place such as Chad. We need to recognize the significant differences in the continent and take a policy approach appropriate to those differences. Thank you very much.
It's now good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me here, and I'd like to also acknowledge the presence of a star among us. Those of you who speak Swana know that Naledi means star, so Madam Minister, welcome. Mr. Ambassador, thank you. We find ourselves often in the same arenas, and I continue to admire your foresight and ability and multiple contributions that you make to the South African-U.S. dialogue. And let me point out, as this nose will testify, I was a boxer in my earlier misspent youth, much of which spent in near reform school in upstate New York, where I was the reigning middleweight champion in my school. That actually the best boxers were those who could box in a couple of classes. I was a great admirer of Floyd Patterson. Before Floyd Patterson, Rocky Marciano. Both of them boxed in light heavyweight and heavyweight. And what we always said was, it's one thing to be a fighter, it's another thing to be a boxer. South Africa has to be a boxer in this world arena. It has to choose its shots, it has to stay in its form, and it has to really look for its opportunities to knock often the bigger opponents out. So I think the boxing analogy can actually work to your favor, because you're really in two classes. You're in a class where you're at the same table in the G20 as the heavyweights are, but on the other hand, you're also representing many of the interests of the lighter heavyweights or the lighter classes. I think you have an unusual entree to both classes and to both arenas. And I think that's a position that really is a position of advantage than disadvantage. And I think that your ability to converse and show leadership in all those categories and those classes is going to be one that will unfold to your great benefit and gain in both leadership and in economic evolution. But the coincidence of our new administrations both in Pretoria and Washington offer a solid opportunity to advance trade relations between our two countries. This paper, which is co-formulated with my partner Steve Landy, suggests an approach to carry out these objectives. U.S.-South Africa trade relations have recently been strained due to the failure of the SACU negotiations, which we've spoken about, and continuing differences in Geneva on the WTO agenda. The failure of SACU was kind of a mutual blame game, with the U.S. accusing South Africa of being excessively obstructionist and South Africa accusing the U.S. of trying to impose a preconceived model agreement on SACU. In Geneva, South Africa argues that the U.S. does not recognize that a development round involves special attention to the needs of all developing countries, while the U.S. maintains that South Africa adopts Indian positions by refusing to accept its obligations in the trading system as an advanced developing country. The basis for building a cooperative relationship could be to ignore the past and instead focus on a joint approach on issues impacting sub-Saharan Africa in the trade and development field. In this area, South Africa and the U.S. may share common objectives. Only an economically integrated sub-Saharan Africa region could offer the small, often landlocked or island-based countries the opportunities to participate as the competitive players in the 21st century world economy. With maybe 2 or 3 exceptions, there is no way that 48 independent sub-Saharan African countries can attain economies of scale required to be competitive unless organized first into functional regional economic communities, or RECs, and eventually into a European-style African economic community. This is what is foreseen by the Abuja Treaty, the guiding instrument for economic integration in the region. Coincidentally, this document is currently under review to speed up the time limit originally envisioned to attain this AEC. Upcoming meetings between the United States and South Africa could focus on developing this new approach. U.S. and South African officials might actually be beginning these efforts as early as this week, since trade officials of these countries will be attending both the World Economic Forum in South Africa and the Cairns Group meeting in Australia. The AGOA Forum in Kenya could also provide an opportunity not only to discuss these issues further, but to extend, if there is significant progress, to expand consultation to other sub-Saharan Africa countries, and that will be held in Nairobi in August. The private sector could be included in the CCA Business Summit in Washington this fall. Finally, if there is significant enough progress on agreements, these results can be announced during the next G20 meeting, summit expected also in the fall, and ultimately an agreement, if properly designed, could provide positive impetus to the successful next ministerial WTO in Geneva in November, early December. The starting point for this cooperation between the two entities working closely together on a joint approach in Geneva on sub-Saharan Africa issues. The basis of this cooperation can be an agreement to modify WTO rules and practices so that they no longer serve to inhibit African economic integration, but they instead serve to promote it. The major impediment is current WTO rules, which divide the sub-Saharan African region between least developed and non-least developed countries. A literal reading of WTO rules means that developed and advanced developing countries cannot provide unilateral duty preferences to the sub-Saharan African region as a whole. It can only provide such treatment to non-LDCs in the region, and 13 of 48 sub-Saharan African countries are not least developed. The difference between LDCs and non-LDCs is based on UN definitions which were not designed to measure trade competitiveness and in no way was designed with the African experience in mind. The definitions predate active African participation in the WTO, as well as the current efforts by sub-Saharan Africa to deepen and amalgamate existing RECs. And on that point, Minister Davies last week in a speech at Oxford noted many of these dysfunctionalities which arose out of South Africa's exclusion from the Uruguay round negotiations. Economic integration in the region can only be deepened if the trading community treats the region as a single unit for purposes of formulating a common trade policy and for access to third country markets. current WTO rules and the Doha duty-free, quota-free initiative limiting preferences only to LDCs, thereby excluding non-LDC African countries, discourage integrated production and export activities in the region. The current Doha text on market access creates new obstacles to the formation of customs unions in the region by requiring non-LDCs to provide market access commitments, while LDC members of the same RECs are required not to provide such concessions. Instead, requirements for sub-Saharan African market access commitments should be delayed until RECs are in a position to make concessions as a group. A reasonable deadline, 5 or 10 years, would actually serve as an inducement to deepen economic integration in the region. The U.S. AGOA program, dating back to 2001, provides preferences for both LDCs and non-LDCs. And that was certainly the design of the program, something that Whitney and myself and many others in this room were deeply involved in. The U.S. has been able to maintain AGOA since then due to the absence of any dispute claim being lodged at the WTO. I can tell you more about that later, but it's not exactly germane to this point, this discussion. The European Union could have followed the U.S. example under AGOA and continued its ACP program, at least for sub-Saharan African countries. The major WTO pressure for terminating the program was to end preferences for Caribbean origin bananas from Central and South America, and there was little pressure to end them for sub-Saharan African countries. The EU chose not to continue such preferences for sub-Saharan African countries, largely for mercantilistic reasons. The major pressure point was to threaten non-LDC sub-Saharan African countries with a loss of preferential access to the EU market upon the expiration of the ACP preferences at the end of 2007 if they did not sign interim EPAs. The EU applied further pressure on LDCs by excluding generous origin rules, especially for garments and fisheries, from their LDC initiative. Those are two areas that South Africa could be especially competitive, from the Everything But Arms initiative. EU officials, especially at the host country level, indicated that some future aid programs would be molded to fulfill the needs of EPA partners and thus would not be available to non-EPA signatories. A customs union cannot be formed if some of its members are committed to zero duties for EU imports and others prefer to maintain MFN rates. EPAs requires the sub-Saharan African members to provide EU duty-free access for 80% and 50% respectively as its exports in goods and services. EU efforts to provide RECs continued. EU efforts to divide RECs continues unabated. It now appears that in West Africa, Ghana will join the Ivory Coast in signing a comprehensive EPA with the EU. This could be a fatal blow to the efforts to create a customs union with ECOWAS and put strain on the existing customs union within UMOA. In Southern Africa, efforts at perfecting regional integration are threatened by the signature of Botswana, a country that I lived in and still have very close ties to, Lesotho and Swaziland, to the comprehensive EPA, while Angola, Namibia, and South Africa are opposing serious and I think rightful objections. Signatures are an EU tactic to pressure recalcitrant countries to agree to the EPA by the end of the month. The only outcome of this situation is a no-win situation for economic integration in sub-Saharan Africa. If other West and Southern African countries do not sign, there would be a serious and perhaps fatal strain on the SACU, on the existing SACU, the longest existing customs union in the world, dating from 1911. And UMOA ongoing customs unions will not be signed. If additional countries do sign, the overall development of the region will be compromised by premature opening of markets, trade diversion for more efficient suppliers, and a return to pre-independence colonial trading systems for the former dependencies of Europe. I therefore would like to propose 7 points and a proposed basis for relations between the United States and South Africa in the trade arena. Given the above, the following suggestions are broad and I think could be the basis for evolution of common interest. First, require developed countries and economies to provide preferential access to all sub-Saharan African countries belonging to regional economic communities. Majority of those members are LDCs. This would cover all effectively sub-Saharan African countries. 2, agree to provide a 5 to 10-year breathing space for all sub-Saharan African countries belonging to such RECs to delay new market access bindings. This would actually provide a positive impetus for these countries to agree on a common external tariff so they could bind as a group. Such an approach might address concessions made by South Africa, since it's an anchor of RECs in southern and eastern Africa. Number 4, the U.S. and South Africa could set up a special working group to address greater cooperation in the WTO, with the tentatively scheduled November ministerial being viewed as an action-forcing event. If sufficient progress has been made, the initiative could be discussed with other African countries at the AGOA Forum. 5, jointly request the EU to maintain the status quo in its effort to negotiate EPAs until the international community can work out a better solution to the problem. Such a solution could be a multilateral effort to provide duty-free access and capacity-building assistance to the region. Sub-Saharan African region, for its part, can commit to gradually assume MFN obligations on a regional basis and consistent with its development needs. 6, South Africa and the U.S. should cooperate on a meaningful capacity development building programs for the region with special attention to regional infrastructure. In this regard, a more ambitious aid for trade approach could be developed in the WTO. In addition, the countries could work with other aid donors, specifically China, to make sure that infrastructure assistance is designed to promote the manufacturing and processing capacity of the region. And let me just underscore this because I'm as much of an investment person as I am a trade person. And I do think that there's very much unfulfilled collaboration between South Africa and the U.S. in the area of regional infrastructure development. For example, in the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which has been a country-by-country program, bilateral program between the United States and beneficiary or compact countries, I think often does not do enough leveraging of not only its investments, but also looking beyond the borders of those countries. I have recommended, and having been a former nominee to the board of the MCC, have made it well known that I think regional compacts, MCC compacts, are certainly very beneficial. Where I think there's great collaboration is in the area of infrastructure development with such organizations as the Development Bank of Southern Africa. DBSA, which has a broad reach, has worked successfully in many, many countries within SADC and beyond. They bring particularly pertinent and relevant skill sets to infrastructure development, and I think that they could be a great collaborator with MCC in building some of the regional infrastructure which is really needed to make Africa competitive. And my last point, the countries could cooperate on providing resources in training to make sure that regional economic communities have sufficient capacity to undertake the increased responsibilities caused by their amalgamation. Well, once again, I'd like to thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here today, to the Ambassador and to the Minister, and I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Well, that was great. Those are 3 excellent presentations. I think first from Lerato Matabohe, who put forward a clear vision from South Africa about not only the WTO and Doha, but the U.S. Relationship. And I was very interested to hear about the TIDCA and how that might be a basis for developing a common vision on an FTA. Kevin Boyd, I think, identified a number of issues. Kevin, whether we're South Africa's 36th or 37th, all I can say is those are the kind of problems you want to have.
Yes.
And I agree with that. But I was also very interested to hear about the collaboration between South Africa and the U.S. on intellectual property rights, and that this dialogue is up and running. And I think that augurs well. And Tony, that was quite a presentation. Thank you for looking at the issue of regional integration and putting the issue of the EPAs in a very stark way for us to try to grapple with. And your suggestions and policy recommendations are most appreciated and interesting and provocative. With that, let me just open up for some questions here. I think there's a lot to discuss, and certainly I'm interested in to hear what's on your mind and how we can take this discussion further. And if you leave it to me to ask all the questions, I will. And I'm not kidding. Okay, let me go first then. It's a very interesting, China didn't come up until the end, and it really hasn't been touched on in the first panel, so maybe we could discuss it here. From the economic point of view, certainly President Mbeki was quite clear that South Africa, that China is not only a partner, a strong partner to South Africa, but there's a potential downside to that relationship as it concerns local manufacturing. So, Loretta, I'd be very interested in your view on that, not only as you see it in South Africa, but Africa more broadly. And I certainly don't mean to just look at the downside. I think, it's clear that China's playing an important role in Africa, but I think it is important that we're sensitive to negative dimensions so that we can correct them to make sure that it's being, that we're accentuating the positive. Anybody else want to add a question to that? On any other way? Yes?
Not related to China specifically.
So can you identify yourself?
Richard America, School of Business, Georgetown University.
Right.
Ms. Matabogi mentioned the human resource deficit as a constraint on development. And I've been working with a network of all the business schools in Southern Africa with the University of Pretoria Gibbs Business School as our partner, along with the University of Botswana Business School, a three-way partnership. We've created a network of business schools. What can the U.S. government and the South African government do to improve the quality of management, which is a serious constraint all over Africa, going forward?
Great. Any other questions to those issues or other issues? Alice.
Thank you. Alice Deer, A.M. Deer and Associates, former U.S. Executive Director at the African Development Bank. Whitney, I'm glad you introduced China because I had a question earlier, but I said this is a U.S.-South Africa forum, and so I wouldn't bring it up. I had asked Mr. Becky to comment since he gave the background of China and ANC relations and mentioned he spoke for the masses. I mentioned briefly to him a preoccupation that I have with China that I suppose doesn't exist in South Africa, to the extent that the grassroots in many countries are being displaced at a very micro level with, for example, in Cameroon, Chinese women cooking and selling beignet at the edge of the road. And Mr. Becky had mentioned that in South Africa, the unions are keeping that kind of activity curtailed. I was wondering if South Africa has a role to play in the region in helping to strengthen smaller economies that don't have the ability to defend themselves, in helping with that downside of Chinese presence.
Great, thank you. And there's one other question back here. Why don't we take that as well?
I'm Margot Spencer with Jays International. With reference to China, in some of the smaller countries like Swaziland, Lesotho, I'm wondering, are you having a similar problem in South Africa with intellectual property rights with reference to the Chinese and the African women? Because it seems that in some of those countries, the Chinese gentlemen are going there marrying a lot of the women and seizing their property. Is that an issue in South Africa?
Okay, well, we basically have two issues on the table, and I'd invite each of the panelists to respond. But why don't I start with Ms. Matabohe?
Thank you. Wow, there's a lot of interest in China. I think, as a start, we view our relationship with China and South Africa as part of our whole objective to consolidating South-South cooperation. So China, equally important, Africa as a whole, Brazil, India, we don't necessarily, differentiate. I think it's part of our recognition that we need to strengthen our relations with the South. So that is the approach in which we're engaging China at the moment. Because we've realized that emerging market economies are significant forces in international trade. And the share of global trade currently stands at 37%. So clearly China, along with India, along with Brazil, we cannot ignore. And also the fact that 40% of developing country trade and developing country goods are destined for other developing countries. So that's another important factor that propels our engagement with China, with India, with Brazil, and other major emerging market economies. With that said, I think our approach as well towards building trade relations with the South has been that we want to enter into cooperative agreements. We're trying to enter into cooperative agreements that will facilitate trade between ourselves. Similarly, I outlined earlier what the TITCA entails, in that it will be trade-related agreements that we will enter into to facilitate trade between ourselves. We're looking at a similar approach with countries in the South, and China included, to see how we can facilitate more trade between ourselves. There was also a point around how we're working as a region to deal with the downside of Chinese presence. I think the most important platform where some of the challenges that some countries on the continent experience with China are addressed at the China-Africa Forum. I think that's a very important forum where African countries can raise issues of concern to them as it relates to the engagement with China. So there are mechanisms in place. The African Union as well engages with these issues. So I don't think it's specific to South Africa to really speak on behalf of other countries in terms of what they perceive to be the downside of their relationship with other trading partners. As I said, to us, China is very important, it's very strategic, it's part of the global South. We continue to engage at the G20, we continue to engage at the UN, WTO, and other multilateral fora. There was also a question around how the US government and South African government can improve the quality of management in Africa. I think bilaterally, we've got the US could support our joint initiative for priority skills acquisition in South Africa, the IBSA. And in fact, I'm happy to report, I'm very glad that Mr. Lafayette Barnes is here from the DC Mayor's office, because they've recently been hosting an intern in the DC Mayor's office from South Africa as part of the IBSA process. That's part of the process of skills transfer and partnerships, and to make sure that we get the necessary management skills, be it at local government level, provincial government level, national government level. So for us, that's very important. I think at a regional level, we need to come up with mechanisms of building capacity at the secretariats of the various regional economic communities in Africa. I think that's where the fundamental challenges, broader economic development and I guess trade and regional integration challenges lie. I think our secretariats are not strong enough in terms of numbers, they're not strong enough in terms of resources, and to some degree in terms of skills. I think if you go to the SACU Secretariat, for example, SADC Secretariat, there are a lot of issues on the table that everybody needs to deal with, and we could collaborate with the US here in terms of capacity building in that area. And I think we will continue dialogue and come up with ways and means to see how we can partner in this regard.
I think there was one question, though, specifically on the property rights, intellectual property rights, and China. Was that something you had anything to add on?
I think the issue of intellectual property rights violations, if you will, is a global problem. Fine, majority of I suppose contraventions are said to be concentrated in Asia. But I'm not sure if you can necessarily say China as opposed to Malaysia or Indonesia or any other specific country. Yes, we have had challenges of pirated music, pirated videos, and South Africa is as well is a country that also, similar to the US, we've got a very vibrant creative industry, and we're innovators. I mean, telecommunication technology, you name it. So we also have a stake really in intellectual property right protection and implementation. I think that's why we're partnering with the US in this initiative. And because we are also an investor in various economies on the African continent, as well as actually here in the US too, we've got a serious stake in ensuring that property rights protections are strengthened on the continent. And we'll continue to work with partners that are willing to partner with us in that regard to strengthen that. Whether or not it's a Chinese problem, who can say, really? The fact is, it's a problem. So we're dealing with it in whatever way we can. I mean, we're also dealing with these issues at the WTO level, so we're hopeful that once we've got agreements at that level as well, we'll be able to enforce them on a global scale.
Thank you. Kevin?
Yes, thank you. I would just like to follow up on the point in talking about intellectual property rights, where I'm afraid I might have to have a little bit of a disagreement on this, as a matter of fact. I don't think that there's any doubt that the vast majority of fake toothpaste, shampoo, CDs, DVDs, cell phone batteries, choose a consumer product and you've got counterfeit product throughout the continent of Africa. I don't think that there's I don't think that there's any doubt that the vast majority of that comes from China. I've seen it flow through the ports. I've talked with U.S. companies about it. It's coming from China. Now, the good thing is, of course, is that many of the sub-Saharan African countries, and South Africa is a great example, sees this to be problematic for two reasons. And the first, of course, is that you do create quite a lot of intellectual property. Two, you've also got a consumer safety problem. You've got people taking counterfeit drugs that think that it's going to cure their disease, and it's not going to cure their disease. You get cell phone batteries that are blowing up in people's hands. So quite a lot of the governments in the region seem to be realizing you've got a problem here, and they're taking steps to correct it. We've been quite pleased, as a matter of fact, to be doing some training in the region and worked with judges, prosecutors in the region. We've trained customs officials in the region to try to help to stem the tide. It's a very slow process, of course. I think in partnership we'll be able to solve it. I'll stop there.
Okay. Tony?
The WTO just came out with a report, and in one study, global counterfeit trade products, 74.1% were origin of China. So, I mean, I think there's some objectivity to underscore the magnitude, if you would, of China counterfeit trade. I'm not really here to opine much on the China issue. It's complicated. It's an area that I'm interested in. It certainly has consumer as well as IPR, consumer safety and IPR issues, and it also is causing often the deindustrialization of parts of Africa, which I don't think is something the Chinese, in the larger scheme of things, would like to see happen. But virtually the disappearance of the West African textile industry, the onslaught, if you would, of fraudulent and counterfeit products, has created massive unemployment. It's shrunk the cotton production sector in many important countries, and that is, to me, sort of almost a neo-colonial sort of trade regime. And I think that the Chinese are aware of that. They have a hard time controlling that trade, and I think that now they're making some genuine efforts to do so. In the area of market access, let me point out that the Chinese have adopted the LDC, non-LDC model as well, which has excluded many countries from market access on their most recent offer on the heels of the Asia, the FOCAC which was extended to 600 products. Let me point out that AGOA extends to 6,000 products. So not only is it unambitious in its numerosity, it's unambitious in its application. On the other hand, China views Africa as a strategic ally in resource access, in collaboration in the WTO and other multilateral fora, and I think it's important that that relationship and that interest in the relationship be backed by action. Action being to rein in some of these abusive trade practices, to I think put perhaps a little bit more money where the mouth is. But I'm on the other hand, China brings many great things, investment that others such as ourselves are unwilling or unable to make, and I think there's also models of development which are much more germane to the African context. So it's a balance. It's a glass that's half empty and half full. On the issue of management, Dick, I think some of the issues are also availability of tools. I think that South Africa, because of its political legacy and its isolation from the global economy, has found itself in an uncompetitive environment, often in the terms, particularly in the area of services, banking, telecommunications, accounting, and so forth. And I think that some of the management that you point out as being not as advanced as it could be the product of shall we say, the absence of service, opportunities or competitive services. I think that's coming, I think that's being resolved. But let me point out that the issues of services is still service liberalization in the WTO round has been still pretty much open for debate in South Africa. I think that there's fear that opening our borders to service competition would be disadvantageous to certain, existing companies. On the other hand, obtaining the more modern service tools available could make South Africa more competitive in other areas. So, I think there's an open debate on the issue of service liberalization in the context of WTO, but I do think that addresses some of the issue of management style and competitiveness.
Okay, thank you very much. Another round of questions. I've got two right in the middle here that have been raising their hands. Steve, right there, and then second.
Of course, it wouldn't be the same without a question from Steve.
Steve Landy, Tony's partner at Manchester Trade. And thank you, Tony, for really expressing views well. I think the real question is that these views of Manchester Trades have been around for about 6 months. And I'm happy to, and people have been very positive. Howard Volpe has always welcomed our views. CSIS has turned out, and Prince and Lima here today was kind of represented as well. Corporate Council has included them as recommendations to the Obama administration. A special group focusing on preferences, including Chamber of Commerce, one. I've really talked about them. And the issue that I really raise is they're not getting any traction. People usually say yes. Usually we fog most people out because we go into a little too much detail, to which we apologize for the non-trade people. But the question, which is really aimed perhaps at Kevin and Lorato, although maybe well above their pay grade, is we now are starting once again to talk about the Doha round getting moving again. The Indian election discussions that have taken place at the fringes of Cairns and so on have all indicated there'll be a chance to restart. There'll be an attempt to restart this round. This is a development round, not an agricultural round. It's supposed to be a development round. What we argue for is a major U.S., African, maybe generic push to really recognize Africa as an independent, as a region entitled to special attention. Regional economic communities are the only instrument in Africa that has never been besmirched with corruption, which has been thought of by the Africans as Africans Initiative, starting in the 1960s when Africa started, although maybe in 1911. So kind of the question which I would pose is, how do we take the people who deal in the multilateral issues and who focus on these agricultural issues and so on, and that are engaged in these fairly complicated issues, and simply say, if you would just provide a couple of sentences in the final conclusion of the round that will really impart momentum to regional economic integration in Africa, you can make a very major accomplishment. South Africa is so uniquely placed because, as Tony points out, there is no other African country that's a member of the G20. There is no other African country that's a member of the Cairns Group. When the U.S. puts South Africa together with India and Brazil, they do a disservice because Africa has the responsibilities or the opportunities of working with an African region. So the real question is, how do we move this concern about Africa into multilateral discussions where Africa can really benefit from the multilateral trade negotiations instead of, being an afterthought, which unfortunately it has been over the last 2 or 3 for more multilateral trade negotiations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Steve.
My name is Kwek Jose. I'm with the Foreign Policy and Focus branch of Institute for Policy Studies. And my question is about AGOA. I think Mrs. Matabohi mentioned that one of the good things is that South Africa exports to the U.S. under AGOA are highly diversified. But unfortunately, on the rest of the continent, we find that the majority of exports to the U.S. under AGOA are still in energy-related products or relating to oil. So my question if the panelists, maybe Mr. Boyd and Mr. Carroll, could shed some light on what the U.S. government can do, either maybe through review of AGOA or otherwise, or South Africa as a powerhouse on the continent can do to ensure that this diversification of exports is extended to other places on the continent, so that AGOA begins to benefit more of the African people as opposed to just the oil sector. And just more generally, are there any plans of this new administration to do anything about AGOA in that regard, or to modify it in any way? Thank you.
Okay. I don't see another hand, but there's an awful lot of material there in those 2 questions, so why don't we begin with those, Loretta? You're the first one on my left, so you can begin.
I think I'll pass it on. And get back.
Thank you.
On the first question that Mr. Lundy raised around whether or not the recommendation made are getting any traction, I think those were essentially recommendations to the new Obama administration as it relates to the formulation of an Africa policy. I think generally we have been supportive of recommendations that have served to obviously contribute to Africa's development. But as to whether or not that has gained traction, I don't think I'm qualified, because those were recommendations to his government, to the U.S. government. So, sorry, Mr. Boyd, if you don't mind.
Thank you. Trying to think of where to start with all of so many points that you raised there, Steve. I think I'm going to be forced to start with, unfortunately, a somewhat simple response to your question about it seems like a lot of the recommendations have not been getting traction. And the short response to that is you still have in quite a lot of places inside of the U.S. government, you still don't have a core of the political appointees who have come on board yet. In places where you do have them, perhaps at USTR, for instance, you've got folks that have been on board for a month. It takes a while to come into the portfolio and really prepare. In the case of Commerce, we've got a secretary and a couple of other people sort of roaming around on the 5th floor, but basically we are in a bit of a holding pattern. You've got plenty of career folks that are, shall we say, keeping the seats warm, but you don't have that sort of guidance from the top yet. Two other points. One is you mentioned, and perhaps I'm not quoting you properly on this, I think you said something about that we are lumping in South Africa to the Indias of the world and Brazils of the world. I think you've got that a bit turned on its head, as a matter of fact. We're not the ones who place somebody someplace. You've got a South African government who is choosing to take certain viewpoints that coincide with a South-South type of a dialogue. That's their choice. I think sometimes that tends to lead to certain countries perhaps taking more of a defensive sort of a posture, but it's the free choice of a sovereign government. And following up on that, I think that the African countries as a whole probably need to have a stronger voice in places like in the WTO. I've got many colleagues who say that a large group of LDCs show up and take their talking points from their colleagues inside of other countries, or even perhaps from NGOs, and stroll into the meetings and choose to take those positions. I think the process is far too important to fail to have a strong voice. And I would encourage quite a lot of these countries to work on that. And can we turn to you on this, or?
No, I'm not going to touch that one. I'll say something else that's controversial, but not on that point. My sense on addressing AGOA improvements: make the program permanent, okay, not with this sort of movable expiration date. Include agricultural products that were left out in the original round. And I was fortunate enough to be in the original Ways and Means Planning Committee on AGOA, which goes back to 1994. And a deliberate decision was made, Mike Williams, myself, and a few others, that we couldn't fight both the textile industry and the agricultural industry. So we had to consider that textile market access was the one that we wanted first, and then certain agricultural products would doom us if we took on. So we think it could be more generous in the terms of inclusion of agricultural. We should do more in the area of technical assistance to foster both infrastructure development and regional integration, because developing Africa's ability to trade with itself will also enable Africa's ability to trade outside of its own borders. So I think there's more technical assistance. It tends to be stovepiped and bilateral. It could be more regional at both the enterprise level and direct level. I think that's certainly an area that we could do more on. And I do think that we have to acknowledge that Kevin has skirted around this issue, that the South Africans can ably fill a vacuum here on African trade leadership, and to identify, and I think I point out in my paper, a real African position. Because I do think that there's been a suspicion, whether grounded or not, that there tend to be borrowing positions from other countries in the South. I do think that Africa has a unique position. It should be represented as such. It should be fully thought out, and I think that even in this very forum, Mukisa Kitui has indicated, the former Minister of Trade in Kenya and a very articulate spokesman on trade matters, that the Africans do need more to formulate their unique position and to be able to lobby more effectively for it. Because if you note in the collapse of the last round, it was in part held up in the issue of market access to agricultural products into India. And many of the beneficiaries of that market access would have been African countries. So I think, in effect, Africa abided by a deal that was, in effect, contrary to some of its own very interests. So notwithstanding the issues of solidarity in the non-aligned movement, which is an historic basis, of Mr. Mbeki and others have pointed out, I do think that there is a unique African position apart from the non-aligned movement that needs to be evolved and articulated and supported. And I think we can help in certain areas, but it's really the South African leadership here, I can fill a very big vacuum in that regard. And even if we have to disagree with it on time to time, that's the business of trade negotiations.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
So I'm just going to call on you.
Okay, thanks. I just wanted to comment as well on how we move Africa to the center of the WTO. I think this, for us, goes to the whole issue of reform of institutions of global governance, and which voices are heard where and in what form. We must acknowledge, though, that since the Uruguay round, there's been major steps in sort of eliminating those GATT tactics of agreeing to an agreement in green rooms between select countries, and then it gets put on the table for everybody to adopt. We have had improvements in that regard, but I still don't think that majority of developing countries, particularly least developed countries, have a strong enough voice in the WTO. However, contrary to the point that my colleague Kevin made. No, we're not boxing. I'm just saying, I think it's a very...
If you are, my money's on her.
So's mine.
No. We're friends. We're here to be friends, But I think in as much as the serious capacity challenges or negotiating capacity in African economies, I think it's very dangerous to assume that countries actually sort of adopt other countries' positions without interrogating them. I think we do have fundamental capacity challenges on the continent, negotiating capacity challenges on the continent, but I think each government representative that is tasked with the role of speaking for that country, at the very least, need to know what their industrial strengths are and speak to that and formulate a position accordingly. And also the whole process of South Africa's coalitions with the South at the WTO. I think it goes back to the point that I made in my talk to say, for us, fundamentally, this is a developmental round. And one of the key developmental issues for us is agriculture. And that's a common issue for developing countries. So invariably, we'll form coalitions. The same way in non-agricultural market access, the US has coalitions with the North. That's the basics of negotiations. Yes, it seems like we do disagree, but I think fundamentally for us, what's on offer right now in the area of agricultural market access and the reduction of trade distorting subsidies is rather modest. And I mean, we've been very honest about that. Similarly, the US has been very honest in that what we're offering in terms of non-agricultural market access is modest. So it's a negotiation. We respect that. We are hopeful, though, that we'll come to a point where we can all understand each other and get back to the key development issues that launched the Doha round in the first place. So we're looking forward to continuing this and engaging in the meeting in December, actually. I just wanted to comment on that.
No, thank you very much. The only element that I think wasn't totally picked up from Steve Landis's presentation or question, sorry, Steve, was something that is also dear to my heart, and Tony mentioned it as well, and I think that's the vital importance of the regional economic commissions, and how we should all be about, and I think it was pointed at the South African government in terms of your in a sense, unique position in the G20 and the CANS framework to be able to bring this question into the multilateral discussions, to insist that, or to begin to pursue the strengthening of and the recognition of the importance of the RECs.
I mean that we support that view. I think. For us, regional integration is fundamentally important. There's no way that we can attract the levels of investments, for example, that we need to attract to our continent without those economies of scale that RECs would offer. And actually, regional integration becomes even more important when it comes to, I guess, the so-called new generation issues. Harmonization of policies for us is fundamentally important. Because our view has always been, before we engage on new issues of competition, of services, of government procurement, which we definitely committed and to dealing with and engaging in the multilateral forum and bilateral forum. Our view has been we need to first develop these policies at a regional level and harmonize them so that we can have a common outlook, in SADC and in Africa, in the continent as a whole. So, processes that would support or give us the time or the policy space to consolidate and harmonize these policies in our different regions before we sort of made to engage in them without a common regional understanding. Processes that would enable us to do that would be very important to us. So, yeah, I'll just end there. So basically, regional integration to us is really important. And
all right, we have a chance, time for one last round of questions. I see an anxious hand at the back there, and the one down here with, in the middle here, I think. Alice has already had one chance. We'll come back to you.
My name is Lance Grafe, and I was one time a partner of Steve's way back during the Tokyo round of trade negotiations, and we also were very involved in the negotiations of the SADC trade protocol. And that's really where I wanted to go. Tony, I think that your third point was, I didn't write it down, maybe I can't write that fast, it had something to do with deepening and consolidating regional integration. And I think that this is one place that South Africa certainly has the position to take some leadership. And when you're talking about harmonizing, policies between the RECs, you're really talking about harmonizing rules of origin, which is a difficult question, or has been a difficult question for South Africa. There's no question in my mind about it. This morning we were talking about double vision, and I think that herein is the issue. It's hard to both liberalize and preserve and increase jobs at the same time. But when we're talking about deepening regional integration, it really requires liberalization, and it requires South Africa to lead. I think that South Africa, much of, and I think you said so yourself, Minister Mataboge, is a lot of the growth and exports from South Africa have been to the region. And I'd like to see more imports into South Africa.
Okay, one in the middle here, and then Shaw come down for the minister.
Hi, Patrick Pratt, constituency for Africa. Mr. Carroll, well, actually everyone on the panel has discussed the importance of regional integration, and Mr. Carroll cited several countries, I think Lesotho, Swaziland, Botswana, who are sort of apprehensive, or there are things holding them back from that. I was wondering if you would mind elaborating what those particular concerns are.
Okay. And Minister?
Yes, thank you. A lot has been said about the South Africa-China relationship. And I wondered, in what way is the U.S.-China relationship more exemplary than the South Africa-China relationship?
Kevin, would you like to start on that last one? Okay, that will be all of our questions. Thank you for thank you for ending on a very good one.
Not being a China hand, there are some areas on that I cannot comment on. Having said that, the U.S.-China trade relationship and economic relationship is a very vast and very complicated one, which we are still, through things such as the strategic economic dialogue and through the Joint Commission on Trade, still working with the Chinese to find ways to turn it into an exemplary relationship. And I think beyond that, lest my colleagues in the China office go nuts, I think I will stop.
Okay, Tony, would you like to pick up the questions on the RECs?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the constituency for trade liberalization is very thin and very wide. It's an inch deep and a mile wide, and it always loses out to narrow vested interests. I worked on the first renegotiation of the SACU trade protocol with Steve Landy in the mid-90s, and that was driven from a legacy of we're South Africa and the rest of you don't matter, okay? And that informed that decision, and when the new evolution of a new South Africa came, we want to make this a more democratic institution. It ran up against a lot of old historic sort of pressure points. As we moved into SADC, there was the issue of fear of South Africa overwhelming our markets, and so we need to protect our local markets from an ambitious South Africa. Well, you know, for whatever reason, South Africa was excluded from the trade and the commerce of the region because of apartheid and isolation. It evolved into fill what I thought was its natural trading place. But I do think there's an opportunity here, Lance, that we're starting to look at a regional economic community in Africa that really actually sort of winds up amounting to something. And that's the evolution of this tripartite agreement, which is a fairly fast-tracked and ambitious agenda that was launched in Kampala of August in last year, which is to bring about a merger among SADC, COMESA, and the EAC. I think we now have an opportunity with a new government in South Africa, a new framework to deal with, and actually now a critical mass, if you would, of countries and economies that can actually put some sort of real substance on the table. And I do think South Africa's leadership is cried for in this role. And I think the only way that South Africa, talk to Whitey Bassan. I can't think of anybody in Africa who knows more about market access agreements than the CEO of ShopRite. I mean, you know, they're just in every market in Africa, and they know how to get goods in and out of countries. South Africa needs to be generous in its. Hats off.
Okay, thank you very much. Before we thank the panel officially, let me tell you that this has been a very full morning, really rich with its discussions and many, many issues that we couldn't elaborate on as much as we would like to. We will be doing a full report on this that will be made available to all of you. You will be notified when that is done. Please remember that we're having lunch. What you'll do is cross the hallway here, and it's going to be a buffet lunch where you pick up your plate and your food and then move into the dining room. And the minister will get the last word. We will be getting a keynote address from the minister to close the conference. I think it has been a wonderful morning. We may have learned a little bit more about boxing than we thought we were going to. Possibly double vision is caused by too many rounds in the ring. You know, who knows? But there you go. Thank you for setting the stage for that, Rulele. Thank you very much, panel.